Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Neal Talks Football Podcast. Before we get started, of course, I want to say thank you to everyone watching. This is only the third episode now. The feedback and the reception's been absolutely sensational. And today we've got another extremely special guest, Mr. Ben Jacobs, a journalist that I have followed now for a long time. You may know him on Twitter. He's always very active in the transfer scene. And that's kind of what we're going to explore today, talking about potential transfers, focusing on Barcelona, but also a lot of the big movies potentially in England. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it. And of course, thank you to Ben for coming on. Hi guys, welcome to the third episode of the Neal Talks Football Podcast. Today we have a very special guest again, Mr. Ben Jacobs. Thank you so much for coming on, Ben.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to chatting. Congratulations on your new podcast.
Thank you. It's all been very, very haphazard, and we've been working very quickly. But before I get in, I kind of start with this question in every podcast just to get a feel of things. I want to ask you how you got into football. What's your connection to the sport like? Like, is it mainly cultural, or was it just growing up supporting a club with your family? Like, how did that connection sort of develop?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, like many, I knew I was rubbish at football. So the next best thing is to talk about football. And that led me to the career I'm now in as both a reporter and a Premier League commentator for Talk Sport. So growing up, I'm from Leicester. That's my team. Behind me, you might just see a little figurine. That's me in a Leicester shirt, actually, that you can attach to a foosball or table football table. And my dad was a season ticket holder. My mum, my sister, me used to go. Leicester were playing at the old Filbert Street. The sort of generation as a kid that really made me fall in love with the game was under Martin O'Neill. We had players like Emile Heskey, who went to Liverpool, Neil Lennon, Robbie Savage. They won a couple of League Cups. And then, of course, flash forwards, and that Premier League season when Leicester were fairy tale winners was just incredible to cover. And I was at beIN Sports and I got to make a documentary on it. But my dad used to go into the local radio station as a dentist and do a phone-in basically about toothache and everybody's little moans. And I used to follow him into the radio station, and I was fascinated at that point by the behind the scenes, because in those days you used to edit with a razor blade and basically a yellow highlighter and tape it all together and answer phones. So I started asking, could I go in and basically do work experience as a teenager? And then that slowly led to me moving towards the sports side of that radio station. And that that I had so young, even just making tea, eventually paid off. When I went to university at Oxford, there was BBC Oxford and effectively BBC Reading, although its name is BBC Berkshire, and they're in the same place. And all the energy was on covering Oxford, and I got to do a little bit of Reading and some non-league football. Again, just going to a game with a phone and doing a match report. And then slowly but surely you start to get your big break. And then I ended up moving into football commentary. And now I find myself as a writer at Give Me Sport and as a broadcaster with Talk Sport. I've worked for beIN Sports and CBS as well. But my love of the game, as you can probably tell from this answer, is just speaking about it, engaging with fans, being immersed in the culture. And I love the performative aspect as well about commentary, particularly in radio, because you are the eyes and the ears of the people listening. You're the only thing that can guide them through the game. And an old boss once said to me, it doesn't matter if your game is boring and it's a drab 0-0. It's entertainment for the people listening through radio, and you've got to catch their attention and keep them focused. And when you get excited, they get excited with you. And it's so, I think, unique compared even to broadcasting here or doing a TV game, because every single person listening to you on the radio is reliant on you to make it an occasion and a performance. So you actually feel part of it rather than just a spectator on the sidelines. And that's what I love about my job.
You know, you mentioned that, and obviously I can't fully resonate because of the difference in the scale, but just as someone who tweets about games, you know, I have people messaging me being like, I pretty much watched the entire game. I missed it today, but I was keeping up with your tweets, and that's how I got through the game. Obviously, it's not the same as actually commentating and guiding people through that experience, but it is so much more immersive. You feel like you're part of like this huge community, and just being able to write about it on Twitter has made me sort of in touch with that aspect. And you talk about Leicester. I can't imagine how it would have been being a part of that magical sort of season and covering it and getting into the whole behind the scenes aspect. Another aspect is, I obviously follow you on Twitter, especially during the transfer season. And from a personal perspective, this is something I've always been so interested in. I've never got to speak to someone who's in that world fully, but what is it like the life when you're in the middle of a transfer window, just, reporting, tweeting? Is it hectic? Like, how does it feel to be in that?
Yeah, it's non-stop, and it's a bit like being on call because you don't know when a story is going to break. So
Yeah.
there's no 9 till 5, and you can prep as much as you like. And that's the hard part outside of the window when you put in the graph that doesn't have a story, but you're building relationships. And in essence, if people like you and trust you, eventually it will pay off professionally. But as I say to all young journalists, if you just find someone's phone number or meet them for the first time and you dive straight in seeking information, you can come across in many ways as a little bit desperate or pushy. And you always have to respect the fact that we're in a sphere, particularly when the window is open, where the people doing the deals want to do the deals. Sometimes they want it out there in the media, sometimes they don't, but they're busy. So you cash in because the hard work you put outside of the window, building relationships, traveling around and meeting people, never, from my perspective, with the expectation of stories or information. I just like to keep in touch with people and have them look at me as somebody that's relatively ever present. I know about their birthdays, the teams they really support, their family members, and I build all of that up. And I think person first, not story, because that way, when you need to go in for the kill, and that's an art in itself, when to turn the screw, these are contacts that like you, that have a personal, not just a professional relationship with you, and hopefully eventually trust you with a story. During the window itself, there's a few points that I would note. The first should be obvious. Focus on being right, not first. And if you can be right and first, then brilliant. But don't be first and wrong, because you can get one story where it either changes or you had duff information, and that can undermine everything. And I've got lots of stories where something I was confident in reporting simply changed. And that's the challenge. You may have been right at the time you put it out there, but a day or a week later, it alters. And then, of course, social media tends to revisit your original post, even if you've actually course corrected. Because remember, a transfer market is itself unreliable. And a lot of deals do have twists and turns. So you also have to think about, when do I want to enter this conversation? When I know there's interest, when I know there's an offer, when I know it's close to being a done deal, when I know a medical is booked. And I think different journalists have different styles of how they present their information. And I always try to go for context, both on air, online, on social media. So hopefully people, by listening to me, understand the window in more detail, as well as the stories that happen. But when the window is open, you have some challenges, of course. There's a lot of competition. It happens at super speed sometimes. Certain people need to be more protective because they might represent a club, or they might be in the room and confidentiality could be at play. Other people might be a little bit more free with their information. And as a journalist, you have to put scrutiny on everything. So not only multi-sourcing your information, which takes time, but making sure that you don't just receive the information. And a lot of people perhaps think we report what we're told, but the reality is we scrutinize what we're told. Because if somebody's offering you information too freely, you might go, are they trying to create competitive tension? Do they want their client linked with a particular club? Does a potential buyer want you to know there's another target because it puts pressure on the seller? So we have to think through all these permutations, which is why we double source our information. And then we get to the point where we finally publish. And some deals, you wake up in the morning and you're like, great, I'm really in control of this. I've got all the right sources and I feel like I'm going to break it first. Others, somebody else, to their credit, gets it out before you. And that can help sometimes because it opens the door to information, because once one thing is out there, there's a domino effect. And that means that if another journalist perhaps breaks that this club likes this player, you might be able to get, has the offer been accepted? What is the fee? What is the contract length? What number shirt are they going to wear? So you can always move the story along. And then the final thing, I think, is just how we want to present that information. So 10 years ago, you'd have grabbed it and said, I can write this at my own leisure. It's going to go on the back page of a newspaper. Now in this digital age, I think there's a logic of going digital first. So I'll alert the people I'm working with to it. I'll often go on mainstream media as a broadcaster first, or I'll write it for Gimme Sport. But then at the same time, I'll get it quickly on my channels as well, because that's a different kind of audience. It's a global audience. It can be aggregated very quickly. And that allows you to get your top line story out there and then potentially after it, write something a bit more considered. So it's challenging. It's hard work. It can be 24/7.
Yeah.
There can be no sleep. We live off Coca-Cola or coffee. But at the end of the day, when you get a big story out there and you are first to it, it's also very rewarding.
It's so interesting how you answer that, because my next question is, again, something I've been wondering for a long time, is like, how do you sort of verify your sources? Because different people have different interests in mind, right? Like it would be, I'd imagine, quite difficult to sort of pedestalize certain information over others, certain sources over others. And like you said, you have to scrutinize and verify to come to a conclusion. So it's not just, I've always wondered if it's, oh, this is what I got told and this is what I reported, but that's at least not how you do it.
No, I mean, you should never report what you get told. You should scrutinize what you get told and multi-source. And if you get two different sides of the story, you might not report, or you might report something that neither side are that happy with, but you may feel it's balanced. And then you always have to be prepared to defend your position, both to sources, but also to the industry at large, including fans, which is why I love coming on these podcasts, because we should be accountable. And fans are in a really privileged position because they know more about their club than me. So if I put forwards a transfer or a story, I relish that engagement and to see how my reporting, and if it's a transfer, how the names I put out there are received by that fan base. But in essence, when you build up a network, you can verify it in a number of ways. The first is over time, you learn who's in the room, who's trustworthy. So a bit like playing a game of poker, you start to understand, okay, this person spins more than this person, and this person I've known for 10, 15 years, and they've never let me down with information. And of course, that means if one of your tier one, totally reliable sources comes to you with something, you think, okay, this has got a very high likelihood of being true. But what people don't appreciate is if you just publish that, there's people on the other side that even if they dispute it and you still end up going with it, still deserve the right of a reply. And even at a really base level, there's people that work with agencies or in communications that may not be privy to the same information as you. But can you imagine if I say something and then it's correct, but the communications lead at a football club or the agent of the player don't know what's coming, then every single other journalist is going to be calling up those people to verify. So they're still part of the story, even if they weren't privy to the information, and even if your story is correct. So you have to also think not just story first, but courtesy first, and make sure that if you're going to be giving people late night phone calls because you've posted something, they're also aware of what's coming as well. And that's where it takes time. And then verification is tough. Sometimes you have to make a judgment call and put yourself on the line. And if you are too worried about your story being challenged or wrong, you might just say to your editor, no. And that's the other battle. Internally, your editor might want to go with a story before you. They might want to wait, and you might be positive that it needs to get out there, and then you might get out scooped. So you're having to manage internal relationships as well, whilst always, of course, protecting your sources. The most asked question to me always is, who are your sources? And no journalist in their right mind would ever say who their sources are. And even if your source screws you over, by the way, you still have to defend that source and protect them, because you never know what might happen in the future. And if you expose one source, then the industry will soon learn that you're not trustworthy. So sometimes you did all your due diligence and you get given a line, and for whatever reason, something may change. And you may feel, I wish I hadn't reported that. But you can't turn around and go, but this person at this football club told me it, and they're in the room, so it's on them, not me. You have to always be pragmatic and respectful and protective of every single relationship. And then to give you a more specific example, when Lionel Messi joined Inter Miami, you may recall there were meetings with Barcelona. There was spin from Barca saying maybe it's possible, even though it didn't ever appear to be the case. And I think Messi knew that because of the financial situation at the time. There was spin from PSG at one point after the World Cup saying Messi might extend. There was spin from Saudi saying they were confident. And there was spin from Inter Miami saying that they were in advanced talks as well. And in a weird way, nobody was wrong, because 24 hours before Messi joined Inter Miami, Messi's dad and Joan Laporta were in a room still discussing what might or might not be possible. Saudi Arabia at the same time, believe it or not, had a private jet ready because Messi had made a secret visit to Saudi Arabia. He'd looked at the facilities and the club, and they were confident enough that they had the medical ready, but they didn't have the green light on the project. Inter Miami had everything in place, but they were obviously aware that Saudi were pushing and that Barcelona were holding conversations. And by that point, PSG knew that Messi were leaving. But in the December after the World Cup, it was quite the opposite. So you know that there's half-truths, or you even know that the perspective of each side is perhaps legitimate, because if Saudi say they're confident, you can report that Saudi are confident, but Saudi are not speaking to Inter Miami or potentially to other people around the deal. They're largely focused just on the Messi side, and maybe your PSG sources are giving you a different steer. Maybe Inter Miami and Barcelona are telling you information that the Saudis don't know, and vice versa. So then you have to work out, how do I present this, and when is the right time to say definitively Messi is going to Inter Miami? And that's a tough one, because it's a massive story. You want to be first, but you absolutely can't be wrong. So again, you have to be very responsible and pragmatic. And if you can't be first and right, then it's better to be second and right than first and wrong.
And I also think, just as a fan, the world of transfers and transfer rumors has become so much bigger now with social media and Twitter than it possibly ever was. The amount of people you're impacting, also the accountability factor on social media, how fast news spreads. Like you said, it could be anywhere in the world, it could be reaching the players, the clubs, and there's so much accountability on the aggregators, and also especially the journalists who are breaking these stories. I think part of that responsibility, I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you any names, but when you're on Twitter, you see that responsibility sometimes isn't taken seriously, and you see people with motivations and intentions that aren't in the best interests of the people consuming the content, the fans, the clubs, the players, and there's so much stuff that floats around that simply is harmful and detrimental in a lot of ways. So it is refreshing and very, very telling of your own practices to see how much thought goes into it. And I think that's something people need to realize, that the actual people working behind the scenes, it's not as simple as hearing and reporting. And there is a lot of accountability and responsibility that goes into this line of work.
Yeah, I think so. And also, you can't control how somebody aggregates, and often we'll push people to put a link if there's a written piece, because everything is there. But naturally, the filter that is social media will lean you to see things that resonate with you. So if you're a Barcelona fan, then you're going to see a lot of Barcelona news and maybe not a lot of Real Madrid news. And aggregation is fascinating because it's not done in the same way as journalism, where we will put all of our information into one story. It's more of an extraction process. And even if that extraction is done genuinely and faithfully, you would not expect a Manchester United or a Barcelona aggregator to put in all the lines about Real Madrid or Liverpool. So if I say a player's linked with 4 clubs and I give the full context, each of those club accounts might only choose with limited characters to lift the bit that suits them and they think is interesting to their audience. And I suppose generally people sometimes hear what they want to hear and they read what they want to read. But then when it's summarized, the challenge as a journalist is that your account or another big aggregator may still be the first window through which people see my reporting. And as a result, sometimes what you find is that you've said something with all the finesse and all of the context, which is so important. And then everyone's seeing that news for the first time in a summary through somebody else's account. And yes, you hope they go onto your page, but what if they're listening here? And the first aggregation online is through this podcast straight onto social media. And then not everyone will know where it's from. Not everyone will go back and listen to the full answer. And I find that a lot as a broadcaster, that I'll go on TalkSport. And the beauty of TalkSport is they're excellent, because if I go on air, it will be on YouTube, it will be online. But in theory, if you're in your car and you hear it live on TalkSport, before we've gotten around to that multi-platform landing spot for what I've said in its full context, it might already be on social media. And if it has been, even if it is unintentional, reflected in a way that doesn't match what I said. A good example of that is the other day, I reported, 1, Fulham's preference is to extend Marco Silva's contract, but if they hit a roadblock after trying, and ideally getting him to sign long-term, then there could be a situation where Fulham are forced to look at other options. And that got turned into, Ben Jacobs says, Fulham are considering sacking Marco Silva. And the key point in all of this is that Fulham's number one priority is to get Marco Silva to extend. If they realise definitively that he's not going to sign and his contract expires in the summer, of course they have to start looking at other options and weighing up his future. But then you find that several outlets headline, because it gains clicks, on the Silva could be sacked, which is not what I said. And if that gets out there before your article or before you've had a chance to give the context after coming off a live broadcast or podcast, that can be very challenging, because you're ultimately defending a line of reporting that you never actually reported.
No, that's very interesting. So much goes on behind the scenes. It's fascinating just taking this in firsthand from you. And now getting into some actual transfers.
The meat.
The meat, right? I know people are probably, where are the transfers? So getting into the transfers, I've seen you report about Etta Ion quite a lot these past few weeks. And it is, of course, a well-known fact that Robert Lewandowski's contract with Barcelona expires at the end of the summer. Do you have any information about Barcelona's plans in terms of finding a potential striker or extending Lewandowski, or where that situation lies?
Yeah, I think Robert Lewandowski is just focused on Barcelona and whether Poland also are going to reach the World Cup. We know he's had issues in terms of international allegiance and relationships with managers. So that's always been a really fascinating situation. And of course, it's resulted in Lewandowski being Barca focused as a consequence. And when a player's contract is running down, sometimes they do just want to let it run down, because you can have your cake and eat it. You can start to speak to other clubs in January, and at the same time you can use those other clubs as leverage potentially if you finish the season strong. But regardless of the Lewandowski situation, one thing is really clear, and that's Barcelona are looking for a long-term heir or succession plan, and that would traditionally lend itself to finding somebody younger, But at the other extreme, Harry Kane is another name discussed, who's not that much younger than Lewandowski, but is also in peak form. So this is going to be the key consideration, I think. Do Barcelona sign somebody young that might need a year or two? And if they do that, is there a logic in trying to get Lewandowski to do one more year? Or do you go all in for a player like Harry Kane? And naturally, if Kane was to arrive, then it would be obvious that Lewandowski would depart over the summer. On Kane, he'll have the option to just stay at Bayern. And he's saying all the right things, which is very Harry Kane because he's a professional. He's only thinking about Bayern. He's only focused on the World Cup. Everything else is just rumour. And I think we have to realise this is how Kane works. He's not going to overthink his future until the World Cup and the season is out the way. But then if Barca come calling, they can exploit a diminished release clause in 2026. It goes down to 65 million euros, which is better value for money. And Kane will also have to consider, because he'll need 2 peak years to achieve it, does he go back to the Premier League and try and break Alan Shearer's goal-scoring record? And if he goes down that route, he may choose to move sooner rather than later, because he'll basically need 2 odd seasons with 20, 25 plus goals in order to surpass Alan Shearer.
Is it true that Tottenham have like a right to match or a special release clause?
Yeah, so there's no special release clause per se, but Daniel Levy baked in a matching rights. So that would be one option. Before Kane went to Bayern Munich, there was Manchester United, but Daniel Levy basically gave one astronomical number to Man United and they never bid, and then sold for less to Bayern Munich because Kane wanted the move and Levy was prepared to sell to a non-Premier League rival, but was less inclined to sell to a Premier League rival. Now, if Man United came back for Harry Kane, they wouldn't be dealing with Tottenham, so would likely get a better deal, even if they go outside of the release clause. But everything you hear about Kane will at this point be shot down by Kane, because he's going to continue to say Bayern everything, happy in Germany, focused on the World Cup. But my feeling is that, perversely, the more Bayern win, the more likelihood it is that Kane might depart. And to be clear, this is just a personal opinion, knowing Kane a little bit and the mindset. It's nothing sources have said directly or anything like that. But to give you a personal, not journalistic opinion, Kane wants to win the Champions League, and he obviously went to Bayern to win trophies. So if that eventuality arises and Bayern win the Champions League, he may go, okay, there's another tick. Now I want to go and try another league, seeing what, for example, Marcus Rashford has done at Barcelona, or now I want to come back to the Premier League and try and break Alan Shearer's goal-scoring record. If alternatively Bayern win nothing, he might go, I'll stay there until 2027 and take another shot at more domestic silverware and the Champions League. So that's my kind of feeling. We won't know the reality of the Kane situation until much later in the year. Etta Young is a slightly different story, and Barcelona are one of the clubs looking at the player. They've not made an offer or anything like that. Real Madrid are also interested, and it's no surprise the 2 biggest clubs historically in La Liga are both looking at Etta Young, because other than Kylian Mbappe, nobody else in La Liga has got more goal contributions. Nothing is possible in January because Etta Young played for Villarreal and now Levante, so he can't be registered and play for 3 clubs in the same season under the La Liga rules and most of Europe as well. The only way you can do it is if you join a team on another calendar, so they're already into their next season, MLS, for example. So we are looking at summer only for Etta Young. And then there's a few things to say. The first is there is a release clause that is not the same, to my knowledge, for Spanish and European clubs, and it's variable. It will start at around 30 million euros at its cheapest and potentially rise as high as 40 million euros. The second point in all of this is that Levante won't unduly stand in the player's way. They signed him for 3 million euros. They may offer him a new contract to reward him even so soon into his Levante tenure. And that could even change the mechanism of the release clause too. But I think all parties accept that summer 2026 or January, if it's a pre-agreement for the summer, the player will likely move because of his form and his potential. So Barcelona could be there. There's Premier League interest as well. The likes of Manchester United, Chelsea, Arsenal and West Ham have all scouted the player, but no Premier League club or La Liga club has bid yet. The only bid, as I exclusively revealed, to my knowledge, in the last sort of few weeks or months, is actually from CSKA Moscow. The player was offered an incredible wage and the bid was 30 million euros, but it was turned down by both Levante and the player because he feels like his next move can be something major to one of Europe's elite clubs. And as I said before, Barcelona may be there.
Very interesting. I also know Barcelona are very heavily following the centre-back market. You know, they've had a lot of struggles this season defensively. Just around reporting around the club suggests that Mark Guehi is potentially an option. We know that he is a free agent next summer as well, and Liverpool were very close to signing him last summer. Do you know what the situation is like, and is it possible that whether it's to Barcelona or somewhere else, a move is on the cards for the winter, January?
Yeah, the winter's going to be really interesting. So the starting point over the summer was that Crystal Palace kept Mark Guehi because Igor ended up going to West Ham from Brighton, even though he first turned up for a Palace medical. And the knock-on effect of that was that Liverpool's 35 million package for Mark Guehi was agreed. He was ready to make the move, and the plug was pulled at the last minute. So Guehi stays. He's not going to sign a new deal at Crystal Palace. Option number one is that he's playing every week. He goes to the World Cup, and then he takes his pick of clubs in the summer as a free agent. Option number two is that someone tries to jump ahead of the market in January, but then it will all depend on whether Crystal Palace are prepared to sanction it without a replacement. And I think if they can't find a centre-back, that's less likely, even though they'd obviously get a fee compared to losing him on a free transfer. And then you have to think about Mark Guehi as well, because I sense with Mark Guehi, knowing he can take his pick of clubs, he'll think long and hard about leaving Crystal Palace mid-season, knowing that it's the best possible way of him being a starter at the World Cup, to have that consistency playing week in, week out. If he changes countries, deals with a different language in the dressing room, moves to Liverpool and is up against Ibrahima Konate and Virgil van Dijk, then he's not as consistently playing week in, week out as he looks to hold down that World Cup squad. And if you look at some of the other left-sided centre-backs, Levi Colwill is out at the moment with a long-term injury, and Harry Maguire is not playing every week for Manchester United. So stability for Guehi is going to result in him almost certainly holding down a starting spot at the World Cup. And it'll be really interesting to see whether he decides to take the risk of entertaining a mid-season move or just waits until the summer. If something's to happen mid-season, Liverpool would have to change their mind, and they might, because Giovanni Leone picked up an injury. So they may feel that it's worth trying to get ahead of the market and sign Mark Guehi mid-season. But that would be a U-turn in their position, because even after Leone got injured, Liverpool sources in the immediate aftermath of that were saying very clearly, we don't need to do anything in January. We're still happy with our defence. So let's see whether that position changes, either out of urgency or the fact that as more suitors come towards Mark Guehi because he can pre-agree a deal, is it worth trying to get ahead of the market? So Liverpool might be one to watch, but it's certainly not a guarantee that they put down a financial offer midway through the season. I think it's less likely that Barcelona or Real Madrid, who have been linked along with Ibrahima Konate as well, I think they are less likely to try anything mid-season and look to pay a fee. So if anything does develop with La Liga clubs and Mark Guehi, my sense is it would only be a pre-agreement for the summer, trying to get him on a free transfer, as opposed to putting money down mid-season.
This seems like a situation that's very much up in the air, and we could have a club that maybe we don't know about come and try and test the waters with him, because he is going to be one of the hottest commodities you'd imagine, especially after the World Cup, maybe, as you said, with in the summer as a free agent. this is the kind of deal Madrid have been doing quite a lot with the free agents. You know, there was Alaba before Rudiger, so I wouldn't be surprised if they test their luck with him, especially since Rudiger's had his own injuries. You know, with
Yeah, exactly.
and Militao as well.
Yeah, I think Real Madrid, we know, want a centre-back. Obviously, Ibrahima Konate is more the one that people are speaking about. And the longer the talks with Liverpool go on and no deal is signed, the more people will assume it's going to be a carbon copy of the Trent Alexander-Arnold situation. But we'll have to wait and see, because Liverpool haven't given up on renewing Ibrahima Konate. They've just, at the time of recording, not made a great deal of progress. But as they showed with Mo Salah and Virgil van Dijk, and even to an extent Trent Alexander-Arnold, they're not necessarily the club that will say we're giving up or we want it resolved today, tomorrow. With Salah and Van Dijk, who both ended up extending, those talks ran on all the way to late March and early April. So if the January window opens and Konate's future is not resolved one way or the other, I don't think Liverpool will necessarily panic. But obviously, the longer it goes on, the more encouragement I think it's fair to say Real Madrid will have as far as Ibrahima Konate is concerned. And with Konate and with Gay, there will be other clubs. I would expect most of Europe's elite clubs to take a look. With Konate, PSG have discussed him in the past. With Mark Gay, Bayern can be thrown into the mix as well. So each of these players will have options. And of course, with Upamecano or Schlotterbeck, players like that, clubs are looking at, but certainly with Upamecano, they may take less encouragement because the renewal is maybe slightly more likely at this stage to happen. So then maybe a club that thinks Upamecano was higher on our list will suddenly go, okay, we're not going to get him, so who else is on the list? And that's where, as you alluded to, you might find more clubs come into the mix for some of these other players that we're not currently talking about.
From a Barcelona perspective, I'm sure you know this, but I know it all too well. This is a election year for Barcelona, and every time an election comes about, there is a lot of noise from the club, from different sources, from different angles. It turns into a bit of a rat race, and there is a sense that you have to take it with a grain of salt sometimes from a fan's perspective, because you have different candidates campaigning behind a certain signing certain player. Laporta famously, when he in his first tenure, he promised to bring David Beckham, then went and brought in Ronaldinho. So that kind of happens at this club, and it can be very, very chaotic. My interpretation from Barcelona's perspective is, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree, I assume they would want to bring in a striker, as we know, to replace Lewandowski, and a centre-back as their priorities. But a lot of that, of course, with Barcelona would hinge on the financial situation, how they fare with FFP, with La Liga. And based on that, they'd probably be able to make a good assessment sometime after probably seeing how things go in the Champions League, the budget, the Camp Nou is reopened, which really changes the dynamic as well, having their own stadium. And then in the summer, we'd know how close they are to that infamous 1/1, and then they probably go and make those moves. Do you have the same sense?
Yeah, I think so. But regardless of the politics, the beauty of Barcelona is that a player they want will sometimes, if not often, wait. And players they've got will always want to stay and be patient. Just look at Marcus Rashford, who's doing well and is very settled there. I think all the way back to Rafinha. And again, the player made it clear he only wanted Barcelona. He would wait for Barcelona. So there are some challenges. And as you say, being back in the Camp Nou when it's at full capacity and being in the Champions League and going far in the Champions League will all be very important to the bottom line as well. It feels, therefore, in the context of this season and hopefully getting straight from Barcelona's perspective into the knockout stage by being in the top 8. It's a big week, and a game against Chelsea will be a real test for both sides, because lose that and you look a bit more over your shoulder, win that, and you feel that you've got one foot directly in the knockout stage, and then you can start budgeting for that accordingly. And actually, it's equally as big a week for Barcelona women, who face Chelsea as well in a similar circumstance, where whoever wins that game will feel they'll be through to the knockout stage. And because you only play 6 games on the women's side, the loser of that game will feel like playoff might be the route that they end up having to take. So this is a key part of the season now, because of the elections, because we're at the midway point. So you start to work out what you're on course for on the field. And then I think come next summer, Barcelona will feel in a strong position to attack the market. And I agree with you that the priorities will be finding a centre-back. Let's see if it's a straight centre-back or a centre-back that can also double up and play as a full-back, and then a long-term heir to Robert Lewandowski, regardless of whether he was to stay for another year. And then in terms of promises, I think with Joan Laporta in particular, it's been very interesting, because you're right in what you say that historically there were kind of campaign promises. But it's interesting that in this occasion, Laporta's tactic is to be a bit more realistic as a sort of incumbent and make it clear, for example, that Lionel Messi won't be returning in an on-field capacity. So there's maybe less of a false dream there. It'll be interesting to see whether Barcelona think it's worth adding more of a central, versatile playmaker, someone that almost can be a midfield metronome, but where needed, break into the 8 or even 10 position. And we know that Laporta and even Deco, to an extent, have liked a player, for example, like Bernardo Silva for quite some time. I think the feeling in the industry is that Saudi will push very hard for Bernardo Silva, and Benfica are well positioned as well. But let's see whether Barca choose to finally enter the race there as well. And that's another area where they choose to strengthen. Of course, they are well stocked and there's lots of players that can filter into that central area. But a player like Silva is, again, available at excellent market value because his contract at Manchester City is running down.
Yep. And just finally, before I let you go, I was also curious about Marcus Rashford's situation. Now, we know that he's doing really well. He has a 30 million release clause, I believe. I'm not sure if that's verified, but how do you see the odds of him staying on beyond this season, or Barcelona either looking for another loan, whether United would go for that, or signing him outright at the end of the summer?
Yeah, I think at this stage, Marcus Rashford wants to stay at Barcelona, and Manchester United would like to sell him to Barcelona. It's as simple as that. But it's whether or not Barcelona, knowing that Manchester United would like to resolve that situation permanently and Rashford wants to stay, can negotiate around the option to buy. So I would say at this stage, there's a very realistic chance that Barcelona move to sign Marcus Rashford permanently, but there's an equally realistic possibility that their starting point is around the option to buy rather than only triggering it. If you look at his current form, Manchester United would point to that 30 million euros option to buy and say that is fantastic value. But given Barcelona's financial situation, it never sort of hurts to try around it first, because you can always revert back to the option to buy and trigger it. So usually, tactically speaking, clubs will see if they can lowball a little bit as a starting point to get an even better deal. And then if they run into a situation where, in this case, Man United say, no chance, it's fantastic value, and I do think it is a good number for Barcelona, then you come back to that option to buy. And remember, it's not just about the number, because I don't think Barcelona would dispute that 30 million euros is a strong number. It's also about the structure. And sometimes options to buy, especially if they're lower than the market valuation, are framed to allow the selling club to have the better end of the deal regarding the payment terms. And those payment terms are naturally very important to Barcelona. So what they may do is go at the option to buy, even slightly above the option to buy, but just get payment terms that allow the structure of the deal to be feasible. And it may be that the structure of a Rashford deal is actually more important to Barcelona than the number of a Rashford deal. But all signs at the moment point towards Barca wanting Rashford permanently, Man United wanting to sell to Barcelona, and Rashford wanting to stay. But of course, we might get some twists and turns and games over price first, and that's pretty much just normal. And I don't think this will be something that we learn of today, tomorrow, December, January. I think that Barcelona will wait until after the January period again to assess where they are on and off the field. And that's when they'll make a determination of if they want to take the simple route, trigger the option to buy, or they want to go back to the table with Manchester United to try and negotiate. But it's all very positive at the moment between Rashford and Barcelona. Both parties are very pleased with how things are going.
Ben, I have to say, first of all, thank you for coming on. I know you have to go. You have another podcast, but for this conversation, I think what fascinated me most with our chat about the behind the scenes of the transfer industry. It's something I worried about. I've thought about myself for a long time, and having that sort of knowledge and precision, the behind the scenes, is something I didn't really expect as someone not in the industry at the moment. So that, I think, is very, very informative, and that's kind of what I want the podcast to be about. Stories from people within the industry to shed light on things we don't think about as consumers of content. And I think you did that in the perfect way. So thank you so much for coming on.
Of course,
and
pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to listening to other podcasts as this new venture grows, and keep up the good work. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Thank you, Ben.